to Geneva Solutions webcast, where we'll be introducing you to the authors behind our stories and our Daily Brief newsletters. So today I'm joined by Josephine Schmidt, who is the executive editor of the New Humanitarian, and our partner on our humanitarian and peace coverage, brought to you every Tuesday. And I am Kasmira Jefford, the chief editor of Geneva Solutions. Josephine, welcome, and nice to see you.
Thank you. It's an honor to chat with you, and I'm delighted to tell you and our audience a bit more about the New Humanitarian and our work with Geneva Solutions.
Now, before we get stuck into the New Humanitarian and Geneva Solutions coverage, you came to Geneva a year or so now. Tell us a little bit about your story, because you've worked all over the place, most recently in New York. So tell us a little bit about how you came to be here in Geneva.
Sure. I'll preface it with saying I hate talking about myself, but this is excellent practice, so thanks. I came to Geneva more than 2 years ago now, in March of 2018, come to think of it, and I'm ashamed to say that I have not fully explored the city or environs too much, because I have been quite happily stuck into all that the New Humanitarian is. As you may know, we rebranded last year. We were Erin News, part of the United Nations, for nearly 20 years. This year we're celebrating our 25th anniversary as a newsroom covering humanitarian crises around the world, including humanitarian policy and practice. So we've really been stuck full in just rebranding and making our way in Geneva and around the globe. I came to Geneva from the New York Times, where I had worked for about 18 years, 17 plus, in a number of different jobs, both editorial and on the commercial side, which when I first started was quite an odd thing to have a foot in both worlds, but now it's very common. Journalists have to understand the business of journalism. But my heart was always in international coverage. I've worked Hong Kong, Paris. I spent a long time in Central Europe. So I've always been quite adamant about telling undertold stories, which has become a bit of a cliche now. But for a long while, it was quite a unique thing to do, to try to tell the stories of those who were not really able to amplify their voices. And that is at the heart of everything that TNH does as well.
Now, TNH has, since the rebranding, also introduced some new formats and some new ways of telling those stories and covering humanitarian journalism. Can you share some of those insights with us?
Sure. TNH's legacy, Erin News, was started as part of the UN, and we were started, as I mentioned, 25 years ago in the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda. And we were started in the belief that had there been more fact-based on-the-ground journalism, the genocide may not have been prevented, but perhaps would have been eased, shortened, response may have been quicker, all sorts of things may have happened. We hold that conviction to this day. The evolution of the media sector has very much followed Erin's evolution, in that when it spun out of the UN in 2015, there was a very lively and robust online media world. In fact, the media world had shifted online and was shifting very quickly from text, from words, to the need to focus on audio, on video, on all sorts of multimedia. So we've been also focusing on doing more interactives, doing more multimedia. We are experimenting with a bot, so I hope you will all watch for that over the next few weeks. We're experimenting with more videos and with multiple platforms. Erin had been a site. We've just finished, just today, in fact, we finished an upgrade of our site, which we think will make the experience even more helpful to readers. But we're also, of course, very active on social, on Instagram. We're experimenting with WhatsApp. So our real goal is to put our information at the service of the people who need it where they need it, whether that be on a laptop at work, whether that be on a WhatsApp chat group.
And of course, you're collaborating with us at Geneva Solutions to help bring us that most up-to-date and crucial humanitarian and peace coverage. And it'd be great if you can talk a little bit about this partnership and your vision for your contribution to Geneva Solutions, which we'll be bringing in the form of a newsletter every Tuesday, but obviously rolling coverage every day of the week, so you can catch that on our website, genevasolutions.news. But yes, if we can just talk a little bit about how you came to be involved and what you'll be bringing us in terms of coverage.
Sure. So we are headquartered here in Geneva. We have a remote newsroom, which means we have editors around the world. We have several editors here in Geneva as well, and our management team. And much of our reporting is field reporting. We are everywhere from Central African Republic to Southeast Asia to the US-Mexico border. Telling the stories, amplifying the voices of people on the ground, looking at the needs, looking at the way these needs are being met or aren't. But we're in Geneva, which has of course, long been the heart of the humanitarian world. I mean, just look at the Red Cross, which can very much be seen as perhaps the mother, the father of all humanitarian work. So Geneva is a place where much humanitarian policy is thought about and set, where funders, where donors meet. It's a place where there are many, many NGOs that either work in the humanitarian sector or are adjacent to the humanitarian sector, in development, in peace building, in security, in public health. So working with Geneva Solutions gives us a fantastic opportunity to further investigate who's here, what they're doing, and also to use communication as a real tool to join together people who are largely addressing very similar problems and situations. And it's also a way for us to bring some of our field knowledge to people who are working here in Geneva.
That's right, because I mean, there was this, I guess, the sense that before Geneva Solutions was established this summer, that we needed a platform where people could learn about what's going on here in Geneva and how that connects to the rest of the world. There's an audience here in Geneva within, not even within just the humanitarian field, but working across different sectors, whether that's global health or internet governance. We discussed this earlier before about this kind of cross-pollination of all these different sectors, and this need for a platform that can address all these issues on one site.
Yes. Well, look, I think all of us, we're all consumed by part of this pandemic, and I think what that has done is make all of us aware of what a humanitarian crisis is. We are all in different ways experiencing that. I think what it has also done is really driven home the need for collaboration, for cross-pollination, for communication. If you look at the humanitarian sector or the media sector, both are looking at collaboration as ways to more quickly address very urgent problems, and also ways to continue to be viable in the long term. In the humanitarian sector, of course, I'm sure our listeners know even better than we do from our coverage, the scale and number of crises is increasing year after year. The number of people in aid who are in need of aid are increasing. The amount of money out there is not always increasing. And with something like COVID, with many nations needing to look inward, there are great concerns that funding will be a problem for all sorts of projects. So the ability to be in Geneva, to be able to bring together readers who may not be aware that someone who is frankly even working in the same building is working on similar issues is a huge privilege.
I wanted to ask you also about Geneva as a home for, humanitarian issues. Obviously, it's known as the kind of bedrock of humanitarian issues, and starting obviously with the Geneva Conventions. But over time, Geneva's role has changed a little bit. We've seen it, not the focus shift, but in terms of it also include a growing role in global health, especially this year with COVID. Would you say that, or rather to rephrase that, what is the role of Geneva now in terms of humanitarian development?
I think becoming larger and larger for sure. I think in the humanitarian sector, we have seen a growing awareness that that crises are prolonged, that the amount of time it will take a refugee to be resettled, if he or she is even resettled, can be decades. We're not talking about months. We're not talking about years. There are conflicts that just continue to the point where conflict becomes a way of life. We are looking at doing some reporting out of Ukraine, looking at just that. There are places like Central African Republic where we work frequently, where conflict has become just a way of being rather than a crisis where humanitarians will go in, help stabilize, and then leave. So as these conflicts become more protracted and also overlapping, as we're looking at not only conflict, but also the impacts of climate change, the impacts of infectious diseases, everything from cholera to, say, polio and dengue, and now we're looking at COVID, at a pandemic. There is so much more to grapple with, and so the traditional humanitarian role is really expanding. The people who are involved in that role are changing and expanding to include private citizens, private finance, private business, to also open the way toward actors in development, toward actors in peace building, actors in security. So I think Geneva is really a poster child for this new mindset. Some refer to this mindset as looking at the nexus, at the crossover, and possibilities for collaboration between humanitarian work, development work, peace building work, sometimes security. Others look at that as a poster child for this will never work. But either way you look at it, it's happening. And Geneva has become a place where people from these many different groups can meet, either in part of their day-to-day work, in conferences, or hopefully in a newsletter like Geneva Solutions.
Or virtually, like we're doing right now.
Yeah.
Now I wanted to kind of bring it back to one of Geneva Solutions, and one of our focus being this principles of constructive solutions-based journalism. So not just reporting on problems, but responses and solutions to those problems, which is interesting also when we look at some of the humanitarian issues. Today, one of your colleagues, Ben Parker, said in one of his newsletters this week that, yes, often the issues that you cover are not always the most cheerful, but that doesn't mean that there's a way of reporting on those stories where we can look forward to constructive and solutions for those issues. Clicking upon this beforehand this week, it'd be great if we can talk about that. for a minute or two.
Talk a little about the role of constructive or solutions journalism in our reporting. Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you're suggesting, Ben has said, what we cover is often dark, it's often heavy, it's often depressing. You know, will often say to people, what we cover are all the horrors we humans do to each other and have also done to each other by short-term stewardship of our planet, and lack of long-term planning for things like environmental hazards such as storms, earthquakes, etc. So it's dark, heavy stuff. We're talking about human lives that are upended at the best and ended at the worst. So, and I think too, as journalists, it's often our knee-jerk response to report on the worst. You know, there's always this sort of joke, which isn't really a joke, of sort of the competition for misery. What's the biggest humanitarian crisis? The worst, the most expensive? Well, you know, it's all very relative. If you're in the middle of a humanitarian crisis, it is the worst to you. And for readers, they will often, you know, if we look at readers as human beings, yes, they want to be interested in their fellow human beings around the world, but everyone has their own problems, their own life going on. It can be darn depressing to read some of our reporting, and not only our reporting, any reporting on humanitarian crises, on conflict, etc. And I think increasingly our role as journalists, it's not to bring happiness and glee, but it's to add a bit of lightness to our work. And when I talk about lightness, I'm not talking about levity, laughter. I'm not talking about rainbows and unicorns and there's reason to believe everything will be fine, because most of the time it won't be fine. But I think most of the time, and much of what we report on, there are ways to move ahead. And to me, that's what constructive journalism does. And that's really what our Geneva Solutions project is doing. It's looking at some of the dark, horrible situations going on in our world. Yet it's trying to look at those situations with an eye toward, so how do we move forward from this? I can mention that, you know, a few examples from our own reporting. We did a piece out of South Africa back in May on the impact of COVID, and you know, most of the reporting of COVID talks about pretty dire, horrible impacts. Everything from well, merely the number of deaths, the lack of accessible healthcare, the fragility of healthcare systems, the economic and social fragilities that are being thrown up. But we instead looked at, okay, these dark and awful things are happening, but is there anything we can learn from this? And so in looking at the case of South Africa, well, it turned out that gang violence is down. That was a useful thing to note, a helpful thing to note. We looked at the fact that, in fact, there was an even greater push for economic reform because so many economic and social disparities had been thrown up. And I can say that to this day, that remains one of our most read stories. So it's not only ticking off everything that went wrong, but what we can learn from what is happening right now. I think if I could continue for a second, also thinking of constructive journalism, I think we as journalists need to think of how do we switch the narrative. So switch from, again, talking about what's wrong, what's bad, and sort of empower the people about whom we're writing. We did a piece not long ago from the Colombia-Venezuela border about women who had fled there from Venezuela, and now with the lockdown, with the COVID lockdown and other precautions being taken, they were finding it more difficult than it had been, and it had not been easy to make a living, to feed their kids, to pay their rent, to send their kids to school. So one of the women who was in the lead, the beginning of our story, she had lost her job. She was no longer able to go out, sell food on the street, etc. But what she was doing was selling ice from her home. And by doing that, she was able to pay her rent. She was able to send her kids to school. And to me, if we switch that narrative around and talk about what she was doing rather than what she could no longer do, that's really powerful. And reporting that might just catch someone's eye.
That's right. And you really hit the nail on the head when you said empowering our readers, and I think we've really seen that this year with the COVID pandemic. People have, in a sense, been returning back to their roots, back to thinking about what their values are, what's important in life, what they want to read, what they want to achieve, how they can contribute in any shape or form to helping fight this pandemic, but also other very important issues that have not gone away, obviously, during this pandemic. And I think there is that appetite for this constructive approach, where we offer some very concrete ways that either the actors in our stories or that the readers themselves can engage with that story and be able to help in some form or another, whether that's talking about it or whether it's another entrepreneur reading that story and thinking that's something that I can apply to my business in this part of the world.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. I mean, one of our roles as journalists is really to be a connector, to connect people to ideas, to connect them to worlds they would never have imagined, and literally to connect people who are working in adjacent areas and may not even know that, as I mentioned earlier. And I think our work is most powerful when people are moved to share it. We're often asked, this situation you're writing about is horrible, but what can I do about it? And what I always say is, read the story and then share it. Tell other people about it. Awareness is a very rare commodity and can be incredibly impactful.
Well, that's a great way to finish this conversation. But before you go, before we wrap this up, I'd love to hear what's on your plate this week, which stories, just quickly, that you're focusing on, and what our readers will be reading about in our newsletter and on your website as well.
Sure. We just published a photo essay out of the Peruvian Amazon on the impact of COVID-19 on indigenous communities. We've been doing quite a lot of reporting around COVID and in indigenous communities around the world, in fact, because as an already vulnerable group, of course, they are even more strongly impacted by the pandemic. We're also focusing on migration, Italy, Tunisia, etc. this week. As I'm sure you've all seen, there's quite a bit of news coming out. We have a story today on the uptick in migrants from Tunisia to Italy, and how that is being used as a bit of political capital for right-wing politicians who are anti-migration. We are moving ahead on a new stream of reporting that's focusing on peace building. We're working, we're supported by the Stanley Foundation in this. And, as journalists, we cover conflict. There's the myth, the glory of the war correspondent. So we're doing a series called Beyond the Bang Bang, reporting from the front lines of peace. And what we're looking at is, what does it take to make peace? Which I think for Geneva is a great question, because there are talks about Syria peace going on here right now. We had a piece in the newsletter last week about the role of Geneva-based organization Humanitarian Dialogue in talks that may bring Libya toward peace talks, etc.
Well, thank you for that. And just last, to bring it back to you, and as a relatively newcomer to Geneva, quick fire questions on, give us your 3 kind of top things that you like to do in Geneva, what you've been or at least when we've been able to get out and about. And
it's a trick question. Well, I'm a big fan of the Paquis Baz, Ban de Paquis, which I will say my terrible American non-French, both for swimming and for fondue when the season comes around. I have a very favorite thrift store in Carouge, and I'm not going to divulge the name because I'm very selfish that way. And I am becoming slowly obsessed with the Salève, which when I first came, I thought, oh, it's so hulking and ugly, but now I think it's really glorious. And so I'm trying to find different ways to interact with that mountain.
Well, there's always paragliding. You haven't tried that one yet.
I haven't tried that, but I did send my partner on a paragliding expedition, and no, I did not have any life insurance before. He did not have life insurance before sending him out, so he survived and returned to me safely.
Maybe that'll be you next time. Well, thank you very much again, Josephine, for tuning in today and talking to us. And for everyone out there watching, please do sign up to our newsletter, which is daily, covering across all different themes: climate, global health, humanitarian and peace, internet governance. And so please do sign up. And you can also visit our website, genevasolutions.news, and also, of course, the new humanitarian.org website as well. So thank you very much, and come back here tomorrow to catch up with our next webcast. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.